This is Fresh Air. I'm Kyle Franklin. My guest, Abby Martin, is famous for unusual experiences at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. She's been in news articles all over the world because of a gargoyle who has an ironic connection with Abigail. So tell me about your experience in Europe.
Well, when I was 19, they had an opportunity in our undergraduate program for a group of students to go to Europe. We went all over the place. We went to London, we got to see Big Ben, the Colosseums. We went to Paris, we went to the Louvre, and then we, actually on the last day of the trip, we got to go to the Notre Dame Cathedral. This was probably the best day of the trip. We got to go and see all the stained glass and the old bell that actually originated with the building. And the tour guide actually was able to give us the opportunity to go up to the roof. And it was a beautiful spring day, so we went up to the roof, and it was sort of kind of surrounded with these gargoyles. There was all different kinds. There was lions and bears and monkeys, and he sort of singled out one off to the side. It was sort of smaller than the rest of them. It actually, part of its eye was missing, sort of just a chunk of it gone. He started talking about how these gargoyles sort of had stood the test of time and seen everything that had happened through the centuries with this particular building. And everyone started to kind of dwindle away, everyone started walking off, and I remember just sort of sitting up there. It was kind of one of the first really warm days we'd been there, so I was just kind of taking in the sun, and I happened to look back over at this gargoyle, and it sort of slowly rotated its head towards me and made eye contact. And then I had this really strange feeling of kind of all the blood rushing to my head, and felt very lightheaded, and then it was just like this moment of deja vu, and then it just kind of all went away, like I was waking up from some kind of dream or something. And then I just took off. I was sort of afraid at what had happened, and that basically ended the trip for me.
Tell me about some of the experiences you had in these flashbacks.
Well, the first one I had when I was in Paris, after I got sort of the dizzy, rushing feeling, when I was standing there, I looked over at the gargoyle, at him. I saw this man standing there in kind of this gray uniform, but his face was shadowed. I couldn't quite see him. The atmosphere had changed too. Everything had gone dark. Everything was in shadow. When I looked over and saw the gargoyle start to turn its head, I could see he too was seeing it. And he reacted by grabbing his gun that he had at his side and smashing it, and it sort of broke apart. And then I went back to Boston, and I decided to do some research on the history of gargoyles, if there was any sort of myth that perhaps they came to life or had some sort of reasoning behind what could have gone on the roof up there. And I spent weeks researching libraries at BU, and I checked all kinds of bookstores, used bookstores, just to find anything that would just some kind of clue as to what had been going on, and I couldn't find anything. There was just nothing. There's just nothing. And I decided to go back, so I planned a trip for the following summer to return again. And I returned back a few times actually after that, and each time the same thing happened. Each time slightly different. I was always the person standing there looking, watching him turn and move and look at me. But it was like it was a different person. Each experience I would look down, and I would be a young child, or I'd have the hands of like an older gentleman, or just each time it was like I was living someone else's experience, but it was so familiar. It was sort of like a reoccurring dream, but it was reality. I went back to Boston and I decided to encourage my roommate to come with me on the next trip that I took to Paris. And I finally worked up the courage to sit down and explain to her what had been happening to me when I would go up to the rooftop. And she was very skeptical. So when we got to Paris, we went over spring break. And when we got there, we went up to the roof and we waited sort of for everyone to kind of just leave the rooftop. And I placed her where I'd stood each time when I had experienced this, and we waited and nothing happened. So we moved her to a few different places, and once again, nothing happened. It was the first time that that not happened to me. And I could tell she was just very skeptical. She didn't believe me, and at that point I knew it was a lost cause, and we left. I continued to go back time after time, and one of the times that I had gone back, there was a particular time that stands out. I walked up to the rooftop, and it was the same scenario. I waited for everyone to leave, and I stood in the same spot, but this time it was a lot more like the first time I experienced these flashbacks per se. And I looked over, and there was a woman standing right where the man had been standing the first time I had seen this. And she looked very familiar to me, and I couldn't place who she was. But she stood there, and the gargoyle turned and looked at her, and she reached out and touched where his eye was missing, and she just kind of gently touched it, and everything just brushed away again, and I was back to reality, I guess you could say. And I left, but I couldn't get rid of the thought that she looked so familiar to me, and I could not figure out who she was, but I knew her somehow.
So you feel like this is someone that you maybe once knew or has a relation to your family?
Not right away. I didn't really start thinking about it until I entered grad school and I took a genealogy class. I started researching about my family, and it wasn't until I started thinking about my grandmother, who was part French, her maiden name was Amier, that I really started to think about my French ancestors and my experiences in Paris. Um, so when I started researching, I found a family crest that had been used within the Amiers lineage. And as I looked at it, I realized that I had seen it before. It had been on the soldier I had originally seen when I first noticed the gargoyle. And he had been wearing it on as a jacket, as a part of his uniform. So I started looking into relatives that would have been alive sort of in this time period of revolution, and I came across a man named William Amier, who had been a revolutionary soldier, and he had been stationed in Paris. So that's when I sort of linked everything together, that this was William Amier that I had seen. And I kept researching more, and I had actually gone to my aunt's house and was going through some old family photo albums that she had kept, and I came across a wedding photo of my grandmother. And that's when it had dawned on me that the woman I couldn't place was my grandmother, but a much younger version of my grandmother. And that's when everything linked together. I knew that my family had been involved with the gargoyle.
What do you feel you have gotten out of this entire experience?
I feel like the point of it was for me to understand what had happened, that the gargoyle wanted me to know that it had been my ancestry, and for everything to just feel closure and everything to just be done.
So did you feel frightened at any point?
No,
What about threatened?
no,
So now that it's all settled, are you done going back?
no.
Well, when was the last time this happened?
I go back every spring.